The elevator doors closed on the 38th floor at 11:14 on a Wednesday night, and they did not open again. Not because of a malfunction. Because the power went out, all of it, the backup circuits and the main line and the emergency grid, in a single cascading failure that dropped 40 floors of glass and steel into a darkness that smelled like cold air and expensive carpet. Margot Voss had been in this building for 11 years, had run it for 7, had survived 2 recessions and a hostile acquisition attempt and the accident that had changed the geometry of her life entirely. She had never once needed help from anyone who worked nights in a cargo jacket. What happened in the next 8 hours will stay with you longer than you expect. If someone's proving themselves quietly in your life right now, drop a like and tell me where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The first time Cole Hadley walked through the lobby of the Voss Capitol building, it was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and the overnight security guard waved him through with the specific nod reserved for contractors who showed up at unreasonable hours without complaint. Cole was 34. He had a 6-year-old son named Benny who was asleep at his mother's house on the northwest side, and a repair van with 190,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that had been orange since August, and a contract with the building's facilities management company worth enough to keep Stonebridge Mechanical solvent through the first quarter if he didn't lose it. He walked with a slight hitch in his left leg, the residual of a scaffold collapse 3 years ago that had taken 3 surgeries and 1 wife, and left him with a rebuilt tibia and a business he ran alone, and a boy who asked every morning if Dad's leg hurt today and got told no. Buddy, it's fine. Because some answers were for dads to carry, and not for 6-year-olds. The scaffold had come down on a Tuesday morning in March. He had been the lead on a 4-man renovation crew, second floor of a residential conversion in Rogers Park, and the outrigger on the south end had failed. Old equipment, inadequate inspection, nobody's particular fault, and everybody's particular consequence. He had landed in a way that his body had not been designed to absorb. Ruth had come to the hospital still in her work clothes from the Pilsen Elementary School where she taught 3rd grade, and she had held his hand and said, "You're going to be fine, Cole." And he had believed her because she had always been right about the things that mattered. She had been right about that one too. He was fine. 3 surgeries, 11 months of physical therapy, a leg that worked differently than before, a walk that declared itself without apology. What he had not been able to prevent was the anxiety that followed Ruth home from the hospital, that lived in the corners of rooms when he wasn't there, that took him 2 years to understand he had not caused, but that he had not been able to take from her either. She had been trying to manage it when the commuter bus hit her car on the Edens in a November ice storm 18 months after his scaffold came down. He had not stopped working after that. He had, in a specific and deliberate way, worked harder than before, because the work was the thing he could do without producing anxiety in anyone. The work was clean. The work needed doing. A person went in and found the fault and fixed it, and left, and the building was better than when they'd arrived, and nobody was frightened by any part of that. He had the work order in his cargo pocket, alongside a small adjustable wrench that had belonged to his grandfather and that he carried out of habit rather than necessity, the way some people carried a lucky quarter. His grandfather had been an iron worker for 40 years and had told Cole, on the day Cole had started his first real job as an 18-year-old apprentice, that a tool that worked was worth more than 10 that almost worked. The wrench was not the best wrench he owned. It was the truest one. He kept it in his left cargo pocket, where his hand found it the way a tongue found a sore tooth, without deciding to. The work order was for a failing HVAC unit on the 14th floor. He'd been here 3 times before and knew the building's mechanical layout well enough to find the utility corridor without asking anyone for directions. What he didn't know was that the CEO worked nights. Margot Voss was at her desk when he came out of the elevator on the 14th floor and turned the wrong way down the corridor. Wrong because the utility access was left, and he'd gone right in the low light and came directly past the glass wall of the corner office where she was sitting, with 3 monitors lit and a phone to her ear and the particular stillness of someone 3 hours into a problem that had stopped being interesting and started being necessary. She looked up. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that registered differently at 2 in the morning than at 2 in the afternoon. He was also obviously on the wrong side of the floor. She watched him check his phone, check the corridor, realize his error, and turn around. She watched the turn. The limp was not subtle. Left hip dropping slightly at each step, the compensatory tilt that came from a leg that had been rebuilt rather than born. She had been watching people move for 7 years from a wheelchair, which gave a person a very specific vocabulary for the mechanics of ambition and pretension and genuine effort. And what she saw in Cole Hadley's walk was none of the first two. Just effort. The kind that had been absorbed into routine so long, it no longer registered as such to the person doing it. She was still on the phone. She watched him disappear back toward the elevator bank. Then, she went back to the problem on her screen. Margot Voss had been running Voss Capital for 7 years. She had founded it at 28, built it through 2 market corrections, and taken it through the structural complexity of the commercial real estate market with the focused precision of someone who had been told, more than once in her early career, that she was not the kind of person this industry expected in the seat she was occupying. She had used those assessments as motivational material, which was one of the more efficient things she had ever done. The accident had happened when she was 37. A building in the River North neighborhood, a conversion property she had been touring for acquisition consideration, 10 stories, 1960s construction. The kind of property that looked solid from the street and revealed itself under proper examination to be a series of deferred maintenance decisions waiting to become emergencies. The second-floor structural failure had been attributed, ultimately, to a load-bearing column that had been modified without engineering sign-off sometime in the 90s. It had been waiting to fail for years. Margot had simply been standing in the wrong place when it did. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital and 18 months in rehabilitation and returned to her office at Voss Capital without a press release, without a company-wide announcement, without any of the public-facing narratives that her communications team had prepared. She had walked in, had been rolled in technically, in the chair she would use from that point forward, on a Monday morning at 7:15, sat down behind her desk, opened her calendar, and started working. Her staff had adapted with the specific professional competence of people who understood that the right response to their CEO returning from a life-altering injury was to do exactly what she was doing: work. She was not a different person after the accident. She was the same person in a different configuration. Her directness, her impatience with inefficiency, her capacity to read a situation from first principles and extract the essential fact without the surrounding noise, all of this persisted and in some ways sharpened. The accident had done many things to her body and had done almost nothing to her mind, and her mind was what the company ran on. What it had done, that she rarely examined and never named, was install in her a very specific intolerance for physical performance, for the theater of ability. She had sat in rooms for 7 years watching people stand and pace and gesture and use their full range of physical space as a form of authority, and she had built, in response, a zero-tolerance relationship with anything that looked like using the body to establish standing. She had also built, in the same process and for the same reason, a somewhat unkind habit of naming what she saw in other people's bodies when other people used their bodies to project things they didn't have. She did not use her body to project anything. She used her work record. The first time she had a direct encounter with Cole's body in a room. Not the corridor at 2 in the morning, but the corridor at 7:40 on a Thursday when they passed each other near the executive elevator. She had looked at him the way she looked at all things that required understanding. He was in work clothes, coming off a night shift by the look of it. He had stopped at the security desk and was laughing at something, genuinely. The easy laugh of a man who had nothing to perform. She had filed him under anomaly and moved on. Their first real encounter came on the Friday, in the 22nd floor corridor, and it had gone the way it went. Her naming his limp with the flat accuracy of someone who named things. His receiving it with something more considered than offense. He had said, "I'm aware," and moved past her. And she had watched him go. And she had put the sentence in the place she put things she was going to have to look at later. She had not looked at it yet. She was too busy. She was always too busy. She did not think of this as avoidance. She thought of it as priority management. The distinction was, at that time, something she had not examined. Cole came back the following week for the chiller assessment and for the follow-up on the 14th floor ductwork, and for the third item on the 17-item list he was building without being asked, which was a failing expansion joint in the building's northwest facade that would become a water infiltration problem in the spring if not addressed. He fixed what he could fix, flagged what he couldn't, and submitted his invoices for exactly what was in the work orders, and nothing more. Dennis mentioned this to Margot in passing. Twice. The second time she said, "I heard you the first time." She had heard. She was thinking about it. She just wasn't sure yet what she was thinking. The second direct encounter happened in December, in the basement mechanical room, where she had gone alone at 7 in the morning to review what Dennis had flagged as a significant repair scope, a failing main chiller that, if it went in January, would take the building's entire climate system offline. Cole was already there. He was under one of the main units, visible only from the knees down, cargo pants, steel-toed boots. The residual hitch visible even horizontal in the way one leg rested differently than the other on the concrete floor. There was a flashlight propped against a fitting, and the sound of careful, methodical work. She waited. After 4 minutes, he rolled out from under the unit, sat up, saw her, and did not perform surprise. "Ms. Voss," he said. "What's the scope?" she said. He stood, the left leg taking longer to straighten than the right, the particular sequence of a body that had learned to compensate, and turned to face her with a tablet showing a diagnostic readout. "The main compressor is close to end of life," he said. "Probably has another full season in it, maybe 2, but it's running at 82% efficiency and declining. If it fails midwinter, you're looking at 2 to 3 weeks of climate impact to the whole building. Cost to replace now?" He gave her a number. Then he said, "But I can do a partial rebuild on the compressor housing and extend its life through next winter at about 40% of that. Buys you 12 to 18 months to plan a full replacement without emergency pricing." She looked at the tablet. She looked at the unit. She asked 2 technical questions and he answered both without hedging. "Why the partial rebuild and not the full replacement?" she said. "Most contractors push the bigger job." "Because the building doesn't need the bigger job yet," he said. "And you shouldn't pay for something you don't need yet." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do the rebuild," she said. She was almost back to the elevator when she stopped and said, without turning, "What else are you seeing in this building?" A pause. He said, "Do you want the list?" She turned. Yes, he had the list. He pulled it up on the tablet and handed it to her. It was 17 items, organized by severity, with cost estimates and recommended sequence. He had built it over his 4 visits without being asked. It was clear, organized, and correct. She could tell it was correct, because she had been in this building for 11 years, and the items on the list matched things she had noticed and filed and never addressed, because the facility's budget was always diverted to the immediate, and the immediate was always on fire. She looked at it for 90 seconds. She handed it back. "Forward this to Dennis," she said. "Tell him I authorized the scope." She went back to the elevator. She was in the elevator before she thought. He had the list ready. He had been building it the whole time, not to sell it to her, but because he was the kind of person who, when he walked into a building, couldn't help but see what it needed, and couldn't help but write it down. She filed this. She kept working. Christmas came. Cole spent it at his mother's house with Benny, who had become fixated on the concept of snow forts, and who had detailed engineering opinions about snow fort construction that Cole found both impressive and extremely demanding to satisfy. They built the fort. Benny declared it structurally sound and then immediately identified improvements that would require a second day of construction. Cole agreed to the improvements. On the drive home, he thought about the 17-item list on the tablet, and about the woman who had taken it from him without a word of acknowledgement and had still authorized the entire scope. He thought about the wrench in his pocket, the solid weight of it, the way his grandfather had always said a tool that worked was better than 10 that almost worked. He thought about the way Margot Voss moved through her building, fast, efficient, utterly without apology, like a person who had decided a long time ago that the building was hers, and her relationship to it was not something anyone else got to define. He found that he respected it. He thought about her saying, "You're limping in the corridor" in October, which had not been intended the way it had landed. He was fairly sure. He had seen her face a half second after she said it, the particular expression of someone who had said the accurate thing rather than the right thing, and knew the difference. He thought about Ruth, which he did most holidays, not with the grinding grief of the first year, but with the specific clear grief of someone who had moved through enough time to carry it instead of being carried by it. Ruth, who had been careful and funny, and who had loved Benny with a completeness that had left a very specific shape in the world when she was gone. He drove home. He put Benny to bed. He read the work orders for January and filed them and went to sleep. He came back to the building the second week of January, 3 days before the facilities review, to begin the compressor rebuild. It was early morning, before the building's full occupancy, and the basement mechanical room had the particular quality of spaces that were large and functional and unobserved, cold and clean and honest. He had been under the main unit for 40 minutes when he heard the elevator. Then footsteps. Then the mechanical room door. He did not come out from under the unit immediately, because the fitting he was working on required 2 more minutes to set correctly, and 2 more minutes of patience was always worth more than the interruption. When he rolled out, Margot was standing near the doorway with a paper coffee cup, still in her coat as though she had come directly from the parking structure without stopping at her office. "You're early," she said. "The rebuild goes in stages," he said. "The first stage needs to set overnight before I can run the test sequence. If I start now, I can test by end of day." She looked at the unit. Then she looked at him. She said, "I read the full scope last night." He said, "The 17 items?" She said, "All 23 of them now. I added 6 after the December meeting." She paused. "Item 9. He said, "The transfer switch." She said, "I should have moved it to Q1. He said, "Q2 was the recommended window." She said, "The recommended window assumed no unusual load on the system in January. We have an all-hands meeting on the 17th. He said, "I can try to accelerate the transfer switch repair. If the replacement component is in stock, I can have it done by the 14th. She said, "Is it in stock?" He pulled up his phone, checked the supplier, showed her the screen. She said, "Order it." He ordered it. She was almost at the door when she stopped and said, "You had already checked." He said, "I checked this morning when I got here." She said, "Before I asked." He said, "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I knew you'd want it moved if the stock was there." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You've been anticipating what I need." He said, "It's the job." She said, "You said that last time I said that." He said, "I know." She said, "I don't think it's the job." He held her gaze. She said, "I think it's something else." Neither of them said anything. She left. He went back under the unit. The fitting was set correctly. He began the second stage. He thought about what she had said and what she had not said, and the particular quality of a sentence that ended before its conclusion. He thought about the transfer switch, which was on order and would arrive by the 12th. He thought about item 9 on the list. He thought, some things you defer until the pressure changes. Then they become urgent. Then you fix them. He thought, that's probably true about more than transfer switches. He finished the second stage and moved to the third. The facilities review Margot had scheduled for the second Friday in January was the first time Cole sat in her conference room rather than standing in a mechanical room or a utility corridor. It was a different kind of proximity, and both of them felt it without acknowledging it. Dennis was there. Cole was there. Cole's newer employee. A young woman named Paloma, who had joined Stonebridge in November and who was meticulous and did not waste words, was also there, because the review scope had expanded to include VAC scheduling through the spring, and Paloma managed the VAC scheduling. The review was supposed to be 60 minutes. It ran 90. Margot asked questions. They were good questions. The questions of someone who understood what she was asking and would know if the answers were incomplete. Cole had worked with enough clients to know the difference between the question asked to satisfy a process and the question asked because the person genuinely needed to understand, and Margot Voss asked the second kind exclusively. At one point, she pulled up the building schematic on the conference room display and pointed to a section of the northeast facade and said, "This isn't on your list." He looked at it. He said, I know. I flagged it to Dennis last month, and he said the previous contractor had assessed it as acceptable. She looked at Dennis. Dennis said, the previous contractor said it was within spec. The previous contractor, Cole said carefully, was billing by the unit, and within spec meant they didn't have to fix it. There was a pause. Margot said, what does it actually need? Cole told her. It was a straightforward repair. The cost was modest. The previous contractor had declined to flag it because the repair was too small to justify a separate work order under their billing structure, which meant it would eventually become a large water infiltration problem rather than a small facade maintenance item. She said, add it to the scope. Dennis said, that's item 18. She said, good, add it. Cole caught her eye for a moment across the table. She held his gaze briefly and looked back at the schematic. It was not a significant moment. It was the kind of moment that was significant only because it was the first of its kind. A moment where the transaction between them was just two people who both saw the same thing the same way. He went back to the schematic. She went back to the schematic. The review continued. After Dennis and Paloma had gone, Margot was still at the head of the table reviewing the updated scope document. Cole was packing his notebook. He stopped when he noticed her foot. She was making a small motion with her left foot under the table, pressing the heel down and lifting the toe. The particular deliberate action of someone doing an exercise they had practiced many times. She was reading the scope document while she did it, half her attention on the paper and half on the movement, the way you did things that were supposed to be habit but weren't yet fully automatic. She looked up and found him watching. He looked back at the scope document. She said nothing. He said nothing. He picked up his notebook and left. In the elevator, he thought about the foot. He thought about it the way he thought about building systems that showed him something unexpected, not with alarm, not with conclusion, but with the careful attention of someone noting an anomaly and waiting to understand what it meant. He filed it. He kept working. The next 3 weeks were the weeks in which the building started to become something different between them, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the ordinary rhythm of it accumulated into something that had texture. He was in the building 3 times a week now, with the expanded scope, and she was in the building 6 mornings out of 7, and they saw each other the way people saw each other when they occupied the same space regularly enough to develop a shared vocabulary for it. The vocabulary was mostly professional. Technical questions, scope updates, budget decisions. She was direct and he was accurate, and neither of them performed anything for the other, which was itself a kind of trust. But there were other things. There was the morning he arrived at 7:15 to find her already in the lobby, reviewing something on her phone, and she looked up and said, without preamble, the northwest facade item. Did you get the materials order in before the supplier cutoff? He said yesterday. She said good and went back to her phone. It was not a notable exchange. What was notable was that she had known the supplier cutoff date. She had tracked it. She had been monitoring the scope the way you monitored things that mattered to you. There was the afternoon she came through the basement mechanical room while he was finishing the chiller rebuild, and she stopped and looked at the work for a moment without saying anything, and then said, "That looks clean." He said, "It is clean." She said, "Good," and kept moving. There was the day Dennis told Cole that Ms. Voss had asked him to add Stonebridge to the building's preferred vendor list under the emergency contact protocol, which meant Cole's number was now the first one Dennis called when anything went wrong with the mechanical systems at any hour. Dennis told him this with the expression of someone who found the development noteworthy. Cole said, "Thank you," and went back to the facade repair. He didn't make anything of it. The way he didn't make anything of most things. He noted it and kept working, and thought about the foot exercise under the table, and about the expression on Margot Voss's face when she'd said, in the December mechanical room, the building doesn't need the bigger job yet. And he'd said, and you shouldn't pay for something you don't need yet. And she had looked at him for a long moment before she said, do the rebuild. That look. He had been thinking about that look since December and had not examined what he was thinking, because examining it required time he didn't have and patience he was not yet certain he deserved to spend on himself. Benny helped. The way Benny helped most things. Cole had told him, in the fragmented way he told Benny things that were more than a 6-year-old needed, but that Benny invariably absorbed and processed and produced an opinion on, that he was working on a building, and the building was interesting, and the woman who ran it was also interesting. Benny had said, "What kind of interesting?" Cole had said, "The kind that makes you want to know more." Benny had thought about this and said, "Like a mystery?" Cole had said, "A little bit." Benny had said, "I want to meet her." Cole had said, "Maybe someday, buddy." Benny had said, "When?" Cole had said, "I don't know yet." Benny had said, "Okay," and gone back to whatever he was building on the kitchen table. Because Benny accepted uncertainty with the specific equanimity of a child who had grown up with a father who was honest about not knowing things, which was a kind of inheritance Cole had given him without planning to and was grateful for. January arrived in Chicago the way it always did, without courtesy, without warning, as if the city had made a specific enemy of comfort and intended to prosecute the grudge until March. The infrastructure failure at the Voss Capitol building began, as infrastructure failures tended to begin, with something small. The primary electrical substation serving the tower's northeast quadrant had a fault in its transfer switch, a component that Cole had actually flagged in his 17-item list as Item 9, medium priority, estimated repair window, 12 months before it became urgent. Item 9 had been deferred to Q2. Q2 was not January 17th. The fault cascaded at 11:07 on the night of the 17th. During a full building occupancy situation that nobody had planned for, Margot had called a company-wide late session for the final review of a major acquisition she was set to close on the morning of the 18th. 352 people in the building. The cascade took out the primary, the backup, and the emergency generator in a sequence of failures that the building's electrical engineer would later describe as improbable. The elevators locked. The lights went to battery backup emergency strips. The climate system went offline. Outside, a January ice storm was depositing a 1/4 inch of sleet per hour on every surface in the greater Chicago area. Cole's phone rang at 11:11. It was Dennis. "We've got a full outage," Dennis said. "Building is locked down, elevators, climate, primary lighting. I need you here. Be there in 30, Cole said. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring and said, "Of course," and he said, "Thank you," and he was in the van with the engine running before the call ended. He drove through ice and dark and the particular silenced quality of a city in a storm, and he thought about his toolbox and the diagnostic kit and what he knew about the building's electrical layout and what he did not know that he was going to have to find out. He arrived at 23 past 11. The lobby was running on emergency strips, casting everything in the flat yellow of fluorescent battery power. Dennis was at the security desk with the building diagram and the expression of a man who needed someone to tell him the problem was solvable. "What's the cascade sequence?" Cole said, because that was the first thing. Always. Dennis showed him the fault log. Cole read it and said, "The transfer switch. I flagged this in October." Dennis looked at him. "I know." Cole said, "Where's the CEO?" Dennis said, 38th floor. He looked at the stairwell door. 38 floors with a rebuilt tibia in January at 11:30 at night. He said, "What's the repair sequence to get one elevator back?" "That's the problem," Dennis said. "The fault is in the primary conduit that feeds the elevator control panels. To isolate it and restore one elevator, you need access to the main electrical room on 3 and the junction box on 26. Cole was already doing the arithmetic. Stairwell to 3, work the fault. Stairwell to 26, work the junction. Test for restoration. If he was fast and the fault was straightforward, 90 minutes. If it wasn't straightforward, longer. In the meantime, 350 people on various floors. An ice storm outside, no climate system, a CEO on the 38th floor. He said to Dennis, "Get the fire department on the line. Standard protocol for occupied building power failure. They'll want to assess evacuation. And find out if there's anyone above floor 20 who needs immediate assistance, medical situations, anything like that." He went into the stairwell. The stairwell was cold. The emergency strips gave enough light to move by, not enough to do technical work. He had a headlamp in his toolbox. He had done harder things than 38 flights. He started climbing. He went to the electrical room on 3 first, because that was the order the problem required. He spent 34 minutes in the main conduit room with the fault panel open, tracing the cascade sequence through the system with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that rushing electrical work was how buildings burned and people died. He found the first fault. He isolated it. He left it tagged and moved on. He climbed to 26. His left leg was registering the stairs in the way it always registered sustained exertion. Not pain, exactly, not anymore, but a deep bone-level awareness that said, I remember the scaffold. He climbed anyway, the way he always climbed, steadily, without drama. Because there was a problem in this building, and the problem needed solving, and he was the person who could solve it. He found the junction box on 26. Opened it. The secondary fault was more complex than the first. 2 breakers had tripped in sequence, and the restoration sequence was non-obvious. He worked it for 22 minutes. At 12:47, a single elevator came back online. He took it to 38. The 38th floor was very quiet. Most of the company had used the stairwells to evacuate during the 2 hours since the outage. The fire department had arrived at midnight and had cleared the building in orderly fashion, floor by floor. By the time Cole arrived at 38, the floor was largely empty. Largely, Margot Voss was at her desk. Not because she couldn't use the stairs, she could have managed the stairs. She had managed stairs before, in the specific painstaking way that was possible with the chair and the right technique and handrails on both sides. But the stairwells had been full of 350 people moving in organized evacuation, and she had looked at the stairwell door and looked at the crowd and made a calculation that she made most days in various forms, that the combination of a wheelchair, a crowd, and a long stairwell in the dark was a scenario with a high probability of becoming someone else's emergency. She had stayed. She had told Dennis she was staying when he'd called at 11:30. Dennis had sounded unhappy about this. She had said she was fine, she had her phone, she would wait for the elevator to be restored or for the evacuation to thin out, whichever came first. Dennis had said the repair contractor was working on the elevator. She had said good. What she had not told Dennis was that the temperature on the 38th floor had dropped 7 degrees in 2 hours and was going to keep dropping. Or that her phone was at 14%. Or that the thing she'd been avoiding thinking about since 11:07 was whether she was angry at herself for staying, or at the building for failing, or at the specific sensation of being the most capable person in a room and the least able to resolve the problem with her own body. She had used the 2 hours productively, which was what she did when there was nothing else to do. She had reviewed the acquisition brief on her phone until the battery required conservation. She had thought through the 9 questions she anticipated from the external party at the morning meeting and drafted her responses in the notebook she kept in her desk drawer. She had reviewed her key talking points for the board presentation in March. She had thought, clearly and specifically, about the facility scope and the item 9 she had not moved to Q1. She had also thought about Cole, not in the way she had been avoiding thinking about Cole for the past 3 months, the careful, circuitous way of a person who was aware of a thing but not ready to look at it directly. In the way you thought about a person when the circumstances had stripped the careful management away and left only what was actually true. What was actually true was this. He had been in her building for 3 months, and he had never once made her feel the way her building made her feel when she was in it alone. Watched, managed, navigated around. He moved through her building the way she moved through it, as someone who understood the building, who had earned the understanding by paying attention, who read the space and found the faults and corrected what could be corrected and documented what couldn't. He did not navigate around her. He worked alongside her, which was a different thing entirely. She had been sitting with this in the cold and the dark for 2 hours. She was still at her desk, reading by phone light, when the elevator arrived and Cole Hadley came through the doors. She looked up. He was breathing harder than usual, not labored, but the breathing of a man who had climbed 38 floors of stairs in a cold building on a rebuilt leg and was not going to mention it. He had a headlamp on his forehead and his toolbox in his right hand, and he was looking at her the way he looked at most things, with the calm, assessing attention of someone whose first priority was understanding the situation. "Elevator's back," he said. "I can see that." "You okay?" "I've been warmer," she said. She set her phone down. "How long has that elevator been running?" "About 12 minutes. I came up as soon as the system showed stable." He looked at the room, at the temperature. "You've been here the whole time." "The stairwell evacuation was a crowd situation," she said. "I made a judgment call." He didn't say anything about the judgment call. He said, "We need to get you out." She moved to her chair. She was already in her chair. She had been in her chair since the power went out. She started toward the elevator, and the elevator went dark. Not the building. The elevator specifically. The control panel, the doors, the interior. Everything. Cole was already at the panel. He pulled his phone, pulled up the fault log, read it. He said, "The secondary fault in the junction box. It's a cycling issue. The elevator will run for 10 to 15 minutes. Then drop out while the circuit resets. Reset cycle is probably 40 minutes. She looked at him. He looked at her. "How long to fix it?" she said. "I need to go back down to 26 and reroute the power through a bypass circuit. Maybe 45 minutes if it goes clean." She looked at the window. The ice storm was visible outside, the city below lit in irregular patterns. Power out in multiple blocks, the weather doing what it intended to do for several more hours. She said, 45 minutes. "At what temperature?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It's probably 32 degrees in here by now. It's going to keep dropping while the climate system is offline. Then we're not waiting 45 minutes, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were having a conversation without having it, the kind where both parties understood what the sentence was before anyone said it. He said, "The fire department is still in the building. I can radio Dennis and get a team up here. The stairwells are clear now," she said. "The evacuation is complete." "How many people are still in this building?" "Dennis and 2 security guards on one. Me." She looked at the stairwell door. 38 floors. She looked at the wrench handle in his cargo pocket, the same one she'd seen in October in the corridor, the worn chrome in the emergency light. She had looked at it then with the precise eyes of a woman who had spent 7 years cataloging the world in terms of what it required from her. She said, "Could you do it?" He looked at her. 38 floors, she said. "Down with me." He was quiet for a moment. Not performing consideration, actually considering, running the arithmetic the same way she had run it, honestly and without ego. "Yes," he said. He said it simply. Not bravado, not performance, just the accurate answer to the accurate question. She said, "I'm going to say something." "Okay," she said, in October. In the corridor. "I said something I shouldn't have said." He waited. "You were limping," she said, "and I named it. The way I named it?" She stopped. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I was doing. I was making myself feel like the person in the room with the power. I was doing it to a man who had fixed my building for less than he should have charged, and documented problems no one had asked him to document, and billed for nothing he hadn't explicitly been hired for." She looked at him directly. "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I appreciated it." She looked at him. "Nobody names it," he said. "Usually they perform not noticing, which is its own thing. You said the actual word. That was honest. It landed wrong because of what was underneath it." "What was underneath it?" she said. "You were making yourself feel powerful," he said, "because somebody in your line of work, somebody who built things, who understood how buildings worked. Somebody's building went wrong in a way that shouldn't have happened, and it changed the architecture of your life. And now you run this building from that chair, and sometimes the fastest way to feel like you have the power is to name something in someone else." The floor was very quiet. She said, "That's very precise." He said, "I've had 5 years to think about what people are actually saying when they say difficult things about other people's bodies." She looked at him for a long moment. The emergency light was thin and flat and very honest. She said, "I'm ready." He came around the desk. He crouched down in front of the chair and held out his arms, and she looked at him. At this man, who was about to carry her down 38 floors, on a rebuilt leg in an ice storm, with nothing to gain from it except the satisfaction of solving the problem in front of him, and she put her arms around his neck. He lifted her. He was strong, genuinely strong, not the strength of performance, but the strength of a man who worked with his body every day and had built what the work required. She was not light. She refused to think of herself as light, refused to be the woman who minimized her own weight as though apology for mass was a virtue, and he carried her without comment on what she weighed. His left leg took the first stair with the compensation hitch, and then settled into a rhythm that she felt in the way you felt a steady engine, not smooth, not effortless, but deeply reliable. She held the wrench. She had reached into his cargo pocket on the second floor landing and taken it without asking, and he had not said anything about it. And she had held it for the next 36 floors because it was something to hold, and because it was the right weight, and because the chrome was worn smooth from years of use, and it felt like the truth of what he was. A man who had his grandfather's tools in his pocket and showed up at 2 a.m. and stayed until the thing was done. He did not rush. Floor 38 to floor 35, she counted his breathing. Even, controlled, the disciplined breathing of someone who had done hard things before and knew the only way through was steady. Floor 35 to 31, she was aware of his leg. Not because it was failing, because it was not failing, but because she could feel the altered rhythm of it. The extra weight being carried differently on the left side, the conscious distribution of load. He was compensating in real time for 38 flights of accumulated stress, and he was doing it without acknowledgement, without slowing, without asking her to notice. She noticed. "You're not going to tell me how far," she said at floor 29. "No," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because you already know," he said, "and telling you wouldn't help anything." She thought about that. Floor 24. He stopped at the landing, not to rest, or not to admit to resting, but to reset his grip. She shifted to make the distribution easier. "Benny," she said. "Your son." "Yeah," he said. 6? 6 in March. She was quiet. Then, "Does he know you do this?" "The overnight calls. He knows I fix buildings when they break," Cole said. "He thinks it's one of the better jobs." He started moving again. He's right. Floor 21. Floor 18. The temperature in the stairwell was rising slightly as they descended, or maybe that was just the work, the heat of effort in a cold space. "Ruth," she said at floor 15. She had found the name in the employment paperwork she had no business reading and had read anyway. His breathing changed. Didn't stop, didn't falter, but something different moved through it. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sorry." "She was good," he said. "She was really good." He said it the way people said things when they'd had long enough with the grief to tell the truth about it without falling apart. Floor 10. Floor 7. She was aware that she had been talking to this man for the last 28 floors in a way she had not talked to anyone in 5 years. In the specific way you talk to people when there was no performance possible, when the situation had stripped the performance down to what was underneath, and what was underneath was just two people. In the cold, in the dark, being honest with each other. Floor 4. Floor 2. The lobby. Dennis and the 2 security guards were at the desk. They looked up as Cole came through the stairwell door, carrying Margot, and they had the expressions of people who were not going to say a word about what they were seeing. Cole set her down with the same economy he'd picked her up with. No ceremony, no bow. Just the transfer from arms to chair. She still had the wrench. She looked at it for a moment. Then she held it out to him. He took it and put it back in his cargo pocket. She said, "What's the bypass circuit going to cost?" He said, $400 for parts, 6 hours labor. She said, "Double the labor." He said, "I billed for the job." She said, "I know. I'm paying for the job you didn't bill for." He looked at her. "You climbed this building twice tonight," she said. "Once to fix it and once to carry me out of it. You flagged the fault in October. You didn't bill for 2 hours of diagnostic work on the chiller in December." She met his eyes. "Stonebridge Mechanical is going to become the primary facilities contractor for this building. I'll have my legal team draft the agreement next week. The scope will reflect the actual cost of actual work. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "You don't owe me anything for tonight." "I know," she said. "This isn't about tonight." He looked at her. She said, "I've been watching you for 3 months. You do the work. You find the thing that needs finding. You fix it and you leave, and you don't perform it." She paused. "This building has had 3 primary contractors in 6 years. All of them sold me things. You keep showing me what's actually wrong." She moved toward the lobby door, toward the fire department vehicles outside and the cold air in the January night. "The bypass circuit," she said, without turning. "When you're ready to fix it." "Tonight," he said. She stopped. "The building is occupied again in 12 hours, he said. "The bypass tonight, full repairs scheduled for next week. Climate system should restore by 4 a.m. She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the flat emergency light, with his headlamp still on his forehead and his grandfather's wrench in his pocket, and the rebuilt leg that had just carried her 38 floors. She said, "Then I'll let you work." She went through the doors. Outside, the ice storm was tapering. The fire department vehicles were in the street, red and white lights cutting through the sleet, and the remaining building staff were gathered under the canopy, with the organized calm of people who had followed procedure and were now waiting for the all-clear. Someone had brought coffee. The coffee was in paper cups, and it was the best thing Margot had tasted in 4 hours. She sat in the cold air and held the cup and looked at the building. 40 floors of glass and steel, dark in a way it had never been in the 11 years she'd run it. Dark, except for the emergency strip lines at each floor, the building's own version of a pulse, faint and patient. She thought about Cole inside it, climbing back up, not to find her this time, to fix it. She thought about 38 floors, about his breathing on floor 29, about the way he had stopped on floor 24, not to rest but to reset, because the correction was constant, because the work of carrying something correctly required adjustments, real time, without announcement. She thought about the wrench. She had taken it from his pocket without asking, and he had not said a word about it for 38 floors, and she had given it back at the bottom, and he had put it away the way you put away something that was simply yours, and always would be. She finished the coffee. One of her employees, a junior analyst named Yusuf, who had been with the company for 2 years, and who had, she noted, stayed calm and professional through the entire evacuation, came to stand beside her. "The acquisition briefing," he said. "I can reschedule the morning meeting if you want." Given, he gestured at the building. "The acquisition closes on schedule," she said. "Reschedule the internal briefing to 9. The external meeting stays at 8. He said, "Yes, Miss Voss," she said. "Good work tonight, Yusuf." He looked slightly surprised, which told her she did not say it enough. She filed this information. At 2:17, the lights came back on. Not all of them, and not at full strength, but the primary floors, lobby, executive levels, main corridors. The elevator bank indicator showed 1 car active. 20 minutes later, Cole came out through the front doors. He was carrying his toolbox. His headlamp was on his forehead, and his jacket was open despite the cold, and he had the particular look of a man who had done the thing he'd gone to do and was now finished. He came to where she was sitting near the building's main canopy and stopped. "Bypass is holding," he said. "Primary circuits on 6 floors are restored. The full repair is a week out. I'll need the transfer switch replacement ordered tonight for delivery Tuesday. But the building is stable." She said, "The acquisition meeting is at 8. He said, "Executive floors will be fully operational by 6. She said, "Good." He looked at her. She looked at him. They were both cold, and it was 2 in the morning, and the ice storm was finally ending, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "Go home." He said, "You should too." She said, "I have 3 hours of prep to do before the acquisition meeting." He said, "That's not what I said." She looked at him. He said, "Go home. Do the prep from there. The building will be here." She looked at the building, at the restored lights, at the 1 elevator moving in the bank above the lobby. She said, "It will." She called her driver. Cole called his van from where he'd parked it 2 blocks away when the street was still passable. They left in separate directions, into the tapering ice and the Chicago night, with the building behind them holding what it held. Its faults corrected or tagged or scheduled. Its 1 elevator running, its structure sound. The city did what cities did in January. Survived. Outside, the ice storm was tapering. The city was doing what Chicago did in January, which was surviving, which was the thing Chicago had always been better at than it looked from the outside. The building's facilities contract with Stonebridge Mechanical was formalized on February 3rd. The scope was comprehensive, preventive maintenance, emergency response, the full 17 items from Cole's list, plus 12 additional items his team had identified in the intervening weeks. The value was significant enough that Cole had to add 2 full-time employees to fulfill it, and a third part-time one for the specialized work. He did not tell Margot he was hiring. He just hired, and managed the new team with the same economy he brought to everything, and when Dennis mentioned to Margot in passing that Stonebridge had expanded to cover the scope, she nodded and moved on. She had been thinking about other things. She had told Dr. Keeley about the stairwell. Not the carry, she had not mentioned that yet, because it was large enough that mentioning it required a different kind of readiness than she currently had. But the descent. The floors. The awareness of her body through every floor of the building she had run for 7 years. She had told Dr. Keeley that she had been aware, on every floor, of what her body could do and could not do, and what the person carrying her was doing that her body was not yet ready to do, and that the feeling had been not helplessness, but patience. Dr. Keeley had listened with the careful attention she brought to everything. Then she had said, "I want to try something in the next session, the weight-bearing protocol we discussed." Margot had said yes. She had been saying yes to that for 6 weeks. Each time was small, careful, nothing that looked from the outside like progress, because it was the kind of progress that lived in the gap between what the body said it would do and what it actually did when asked, which was the smallest and most important kind. She hadn't told anyone. She was running a company. She was closing an acquisition. She was managing a board that had 3 members who thought she should have a co-CEO for operational coverage, and 2 members who understood that the suggestion was condescension wearing a spreadsheet. She was also thinking about a man with a wrench in his pocket, who had climbed 38 floors twice on a rebuilt leg without once asking her to acknowledge it. She thought about that on a Wednesday morning in February, going over the Stonebridge contract addendum with Dennis, and Dennis said something about the contractor, and she said, without planning to, "What does he do for fun?" Dennis blinked. She said Hadley, "When he's not working. He coaches his son's soccer team," Dennis said, "on Saturdays. I heard him mention it." She thought about this. She said, "Schedule a facilities review for next Friday. I want Hadley there." The facilities review was the occasion Cole found her doing the foot exercise under the table. He had noted it and said nothing, and the silence on the matter had been its own kind of agreement. He had not brought it up, she had not explained it. But the noting had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and what accumulated between them in the following 3 weeks was the knowledge that they were both, in different ways, carrying things they hadn't decided to share yet. She told him first. It was a Wednesday morning in April, 2 days before the soccer game she had agreed to attend. She had been to Dr. Keela's session that morning, and something had happened in the session that had required, for the rest of the morning, a level of composure she was expending resources on. She was in the conference room reviewing the facility's scope when Cole came up to drop off the updated maintenance schedule for the spring vac transition, and he looked at her with the look that was not the professional look, the assessing look, the solving look, but the other one, the quieter one, the one she had started to understand as the look that meant he was reading the room, and the room had something in it he was waiting to hear. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She said, "I've been doing physical therapy. 3 mornings a week. I started in November and I told no one." He waited. She said, "This morning I stood for 7 seconds. Both feet on the floor. No support." She was looking at the maintenance schedule. "Doctor, Keeley says the prognosis may be different from what I was told 5 years ago. She's conservative about it. But 7 seconds is a real number." He was quiet. He said, "Okay." She looked up. He said, "Okay," meaning, "That's real. That matters. 7 seconds is a different world than what you were told." She said, "It might not become more than 7 seconds." He said, "It might become 31. She looked at him. He said, "You've been building toward this since November." You've been doing the work nobody knew about. Whatever the ceiling is, you're not at it yet. She said, You can't know that. He said, No. But I know you. He held her gaze. You don't start things you don't intend to finish. The conference room was very quiet. She said, I haven't told anyone. He said, I know. She said, You didn't know. He said, No. But I've been watching you do something you weren't ready to say out loud since January. I figured it was this. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, The foot. The foot, he agreed. She said, You saw that in December. He said, Yes. She said, And you didn't say anything. He said it wasn't my thing to say. She looked at him across the conference table, at the man who had watched her exercise her foot in secret in a December meeting, and written it down and kept it, and waited for her to be ready to be known about it. She said, Thank you. He said, You don't have to thank me for that. She said, I know. I'm doing it anyway. She went back to the scope document. He went back to the maintenance schedule. And the room held them in the way. Rooms held things that had been said out loud for the first time, and it changed the pressure of the air slightly, in the way that true things did. Warren Fitch had been Margot's head of operations for 4 years. He was precise and capable, and had the particular quality of a man who understood organizational structure as an ecosystem, and had been quietly studying which organisms were gaining ground and which were losing it. He had been watching Margot since the accident, with the specific attention of someone calculating a window. Not maliciously. Warren was not a malicious person. He was simply a person who had decided, in the second year of running operations for a partially ambulatory CEO in a company that had 3 board members who worried about long-term leadership continuity, that there was a version of events in which his role expanded significantly. What he had been building was not a conspiracy. It was a record. He attended every meeting, noted every delegation, logged every board call outcome. He had not fabricated anything. He did not need to fabricate. The record, assembled selectively, told the story he wanted to tell. A CEO under increasing operational strain, delegating more than before, occasionally reactive in ways that left people uncertain. What he had not accounted for was Sandra Park. Sandra had been Margot's general counsel for 9 years. She had a specific and highly developed sense for when something in the organizational climate was trending toward legal exposure, because legal exposure was her job, and she had been very good at her job for a long time. When Harrington, one of the 2 board members Warren had approached, called Sandra's direct line at 4 p.m. on a Thursday, Sandra had the tone of someone who had already begun drafting in her head before the call ended. She put the folder on Margot's desk the next morning. Margot opened the folder. She read it the way she read most things, completely, without speaking, with the expression she used for information that required understanding before response. The expression had not changed in 5 years of reading bad news, which was itself a piece of information Warren had chosen not to factor. She looked at 6 months of notes. She looked at the pattern they had been arranged to imply. She looked at her own delegations listed in a column with commentary, and she recognized each one, and she recognized that the commentary had been written to make sensible decisions look like signs of deterioration. She closed the folder. How solid is it? She said. As a file? It's carefully constructed, Sandra said. As a case? It's nothing. It's a narrative built from accurate facts assembled to imply something they don't imply. Who did he go to? Harrington and Diaz. And they called you. Harrington called me within an hour. Diaz called him first to check in with us. Sandra paused. He didn't know you as well as he thought. Margot looked at the folder. She was quiet for longer than Sandra expected. Sandra had worked for her long enough to know that the silences that went long were the ones where the processing was complicated. Not because the decision was hard, but because the thing being processed was larger than the decision. Warren has been doing good operational work for 4 years, she said finally. He has. He genuinely thinks he's helping the company. He also genuinely wants the CFO seat, Sandra said. It's possible to believe 2 things simultaneously. Margot was quiet again for a moment. She said, he built a file instead of a conversation. She said it not angrily but flatly, and the register of someone making a precise diagnosis. He decided what I could handle before he asked. He took the private concerns he had, which were real, some of them, and he used them to build something for himself instead of bringing them to me. She said, I know what that is. I've watched men do that to women in this industry my entire career. I didn't expect it from him. Sandra said nothing. I should have seen it coming, Margot said. I gave him the space to do it because I was focused on the building situation and on other things. She paused. That was my failure, and it's mine to own. It doesn't change what he did. Sandra said, What do you want to do? Margot thought about Cole in the stairwell, about 38 floors and the honest weight of it, and the two people in the dark saying the true things, about the wrench she had held for 38 floors, because it was the truth of what a person was, and you held on to the truth of what a person was when everything else was dark. She said, Schedule a full board meeting. I want everyone on it. I'm going to present the Q1 results and the acquisition close and the Stonebridge facilities overhaul projections. And I'm going to do it in person, and I'm going to be very clear about what the operational leadership of this company looks like. And Warren? Warren is going to be in the room, Margot said. He's going to present the Q1 operations summary, because it's his summary and it's good work. And then he and I are going to have a private conversation after the board meeting. Sandra looked at her. You're not going to fire him. Not today, Margot said. Today I'm going to make him understand what he nearly lost and what he still has, and what happens if he chooses to rebuild on honest ground, versus what happens if he doesn't. She picked up the folder and handed it back to Sandra. The board meeting, she said. Friday. She was in the elevator when she thought about what she was going to say in that board meeting. Not the preparation, she knew the preparation cold. The other part. The part about being honest about what had changed and what hadn't. She thought about Cole asking her, on the 38th floor in the dark, Are you okay? And her saying, I've been warmer, which was honest in a way that neither of them had performed. She had spent 5 years making sure no one in her building had to see her not okay. She had been efficient about it. She understood now, as efficient at that as she was at everything else, which meant she had done it extremely well, and it had cost her things she was only beginning to inventory. She was going to be different in the board meeting. Not vulnerable. She was not performing vulnerability, which was its own kind of dishonesty. She was going to be accurate. She was going to say the things that were true and let the board encounter the truth and see what it made of it. That was what Cole did. He said the accurate thing and waited. She was going to try that. The board meeting was on a Friday afternoon in March. 12 board members, the full executive team, and Margot at the head of the table, which was where she had always been, where she intended to remain. She had prepared, which was not itself notable. She always prepared. What was different this time was what she had decided to include. Not just the performance data, not just the acquisition close and the Q1 numbers and the Stonebridge projections and the operational roadmap. Those were the defense. She had decided, in the elevator up from the parking structure, to also tell them the truth. She presented for 45 minutes. The acquisition results, the Q1 numbers, the facilities overhaul and what it was projected to return over a 3-year maintenance cycle, the leadership pipeline, the operational roadmap through year-end. She presented the way she always presented, clearly, specifically, with the authority of a person who knew exactly what she was talking about and had no interest in performing confidence she didn't need to perform. And then she said, There's something I want to tell you. The room had the particular quality of rooms that had just watched 45 minutes of data and were now being asked to recalibrate for something different. 12 board members and 12 versions of the expression that was not quite discomfort, but was not quite ease. She said, For 5 years I have been running this company in a way that made my limitations invisible. Not the operational ones, you have the record for those. The other kind. The kind I decided early on that I could not show to anyone in this room, because showing them meant changing what you thought I was capable of. She said, I was wrong about that. Not about the capability. About what showing it would cost. She told them about Dr. Keeley, not the medical details, but the fact. She had been working with a physical therapist since November, privately, on a recovery program that had produced results her original prognosis had not anticipated. She told them that this morning she had stood on both feet for 12 seconds. She said it without drama. 12 seconds. It was a real number, and she did not need anyone to perform a reaction to it. She said, "I'm telling you this because Warren Fitch built a file on the premise that I was declining, and the premise was wrong. But I am also telling you because the fact that he built it without talking to me, and the fact that I made him feel he had to, are both things I own. I have been managing information instead of sharing it. I am going to do that differently." She looked at the room. She said, "The company's performance record does not require this conversation. The Q1 numbers don't need a context narrative. But the relationship between this board and this CEO does. And I have been postponing this conversation for 5 years." She said, "I'm having it now." The room was very quiet. Then Harrington, who had called Sandra the same afternoon Warren made his approach, said, "We appreciate the transparency." And he meant it in the specific way board members meant things when they had made a judgment about a person years ago and had just been handed data that confirmed the judgment was correct. Warren presented the Q1 operations summary. He was good at it. He was, Margot acknowledged internally, genuinely good at his job. When the board meeting ended, the room came to the conclusion a room came to when it had just watched a competent person demonstrate competence. It moved on to the next thing without ceremony. Afterward, in the small conference room, she and Warren sat across from each other. She put the folder on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "Good start," she said. "I have been worried about the company's continuity," he said. "That part is real." "I know it's real," she said. "The rest of it is also real." He was quiet. "You're very good at this job," she said. "The operation summary today was excellent. You've built something solid in this department, and I'm aware of it. And I've told the board I'm aware of it." "But," he said. "But you built a file instead of a conversation," she said. "You documented instead of asking. You took the private concerns you had about my capacity, and you used them to build a case for your own advancement instead of bringing them to me directly." She met his eyes. "That's a choice that tells me something about what you think of the relationship between us." He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't think you'd hear it." "I know," she said. "That's a different problem. That's you deciding what I could handle before you gave me the chance to handle it." He looked at the table. She said, "I need you to decide whether you can work here honestly, not strategically. Honestly, if the answer is yes, I'll give you that chance. If the answer is no, we'll part professionally and I'll write you a reference that reflects your actual work, which is good work." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I think I can." She said, "Then we'll find out." She left the conference room. In the elevator, she thought about the file and about the board meeting and about the Q1 numbers, which were excellent, and about Dr. Keeley's session that morning, which had been the best session yet. 12 seconds of full weight bearing on both legs. The left leg holding in a way it had not held in 5 years. The sensation of it so unexpected and so specific that she had sat down on the mat afterward, not because she was tired, but because she needed a moment with what it meant. She had not cried. She had sat on the mat and breathed and felt the floor under both feet and thought about the accident, about the building in River North and the column that had not been what it appeared to be, and she thought about what you did when a structure failed. You documented what failed and why, you corrected what could be corrected, and you built from what remained. That was the job. That was always the job. She was in the elevator thinking about this when it occurred to her that she was not afraid anymore. Not of the 12 seconds, which might become more or might not, and not of Warren's file, which was nothing, and not of the board members who worried about continuity, who would find their worries answered thoroughly by the performance record she had just presented to 12 people in a room. Not afraid of any of the things she had been managing at arm's length for 5 years. She was also thinking about a call she needed to make. She called Cole from the elevator. He answered on the second ring. She said, "The board meeting went well." He said, "I figured it would." She said, "I presented the Q1 numbers and the acquisition close and the Stonebridge projections." He said, "Good." She said, Warren was in the room. He presented the operation summary. It was good work. Cole said, "And after?" She said, "We had a conversation. I told him what he nearly lost and what he still has. He's going to decide what to do with it." Cole said, "Will he make the right choice?" She said, "I think so. He's not a bad person. He built a file instead of a conversation, and he's going to have to live with what that cost him, and I think he's smart enough to understand the lesson." She was quiet for a moment. She said, 12 seconds this morning. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Not a performing quiet. The quiet of someone receiving information that mattered and giving it the space it deserved. She said, "At PT. Full weight bearing. The session was good." He said, "Margot." She said, "I know." He said, 12 seconds is real." She said, "I know. I sat on the mat for a while after." He said, "That's the right thing to do." She said, "I don't usually sit on mats." He said, "No." She said, "It seemed correct today." He said, "Yes." She said, "I told the board about Dr. Keeley." A longer pause. He said, "How much did you tell them?" She said, "All of it. The 12 seconds. The November start. The fact that I'd been managing information instead of sharing it." She paused. "I told them I was going to do that differently." He was quiet. She said, "It was harder than I expected." He said, "The first time usually is." She said, "I'm not someone who presents the interior to a room." He said, "I know." She said, "I think I needed to. I think I've been holding it at a distance for 5 years, and the distance was starting to cost more than it was worth." He said, "Yes." She said, "You already knew that." He said, "I had a guess." She said, "I'm going to come to the soccer game tomorrow." A pause. He said, "Benny will be very pleased about that." She said, "He'll probably tell me about structural engineering." He said, "Definitely." She said, "Good." She said it the way she said most things, simply, without ornament, meaning it completely. She ended the call and looked at the Chicago skyline out the elevator window as it descended. The gray March sky and the lake to the east and the city around her. Full of buildings she had never seen the inside of, and buildings she knew well, and one building in particular that had been rebuilt in very specific ways by a man with his grandfather's wrench in his pocket. She thought, 12 seconds. She thought, and then what comes after 12 seconds? She thought, find out. The elevator opened into the lobby. She crossed it in the way she crossed everything, at pace, efficiently, without apology, and she went back to work. She had not told anyone. She was going to tell someone. She knew who she was going to tell. Cole was in the building on a Saturday morning in April, which was not typical for a Saturday, but was necessary, because the secondary chiller bypass they'd installed in January needed a seasonal recalibration before the building's spring cooling load came online. He was on the 14th floor in the mechanical room, recalibrating. When his phone rang and the display said M. Voss, he answered. "Are you in the building?" she said. 14th floor, he said. "Can you come up when you're done?" He said he could. He finished the calibration, documented the readings, and took the elevator, the fully repaired elevator, all systems nominal, up to 38. She was at her desk. She was at her desk the way she was always at her desk, looking like someone who lived there, because she mostly did. He sat in the chair across from her without being asked, because by March he had stopped waiting to be asked. She said, "I had PT this morning." He said, "How'd it go?" She said, 12 seconds. He looked at her. She said, "Standing. Full weight bearing. 12 seconds on both legs." She was looking at her hands. "Dr. Keeley thinks the prognosis has changed." He said, "Okay." She looked up. He said, "Okay, meaning that's good news. That's genuinely good news." She said, "It might not become more than 12 seconds. She's conservative." He said, "How long were you at 7 seconds before 12 seconds? A pause. She said, 6 weeks. He said, "Then you'll find out." She was quiet. She said, "I haven't told anyone." He said, "I know." She said, "You didn't know." He said, "No, but I knew there was something you were carrying that you weren't telling anyone yet. You've had that look since February." She looked at him. She said, "What look?" He said, The look of someone who's found something they're not ready to say out loud yet. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "You do that. You look at things and you see what's there and you don't say anything until it's the right time to say it." He said, "That's the job." She said, "That's not the job." He met her eyes. She said, "You've been doing that since October. In this building. With me. You see things and you file them and you wait, and when the time is right you say them without making a ceremony of it." She paused. "Nobody has ever done that with me." He said, "Margot." It was the first time he'd used her name. She said, "I know what I'm saying." He said, "I know you do." She said, "I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is." He said, "Neither do I." But Benny's soccer game is tomorrow at 9. He's been talking about someone he wants to invite, and I've been trying to figure out how to have that conversation. And I think the conversation is this one. She looked at him. He said, he wants to invite the lady from the building. She said, he doesn't know the lady from the building. He said, he knows I talk about her. He was looking at her with the look that was not the work look, not the assessing the problem look. The other one, he thinks she seems interesting. She said, he's 6. He said, he's also right. The room was quiet. Outside, April in Chicago was doing something that was almost spring, the light coming through the windows with the tentative quality of a season that wasn't sure yet whether it had permission to arrive. She said, tell him I'll think about it. He said, he'll take that. She picked up her pen. He picked up his toolbox. They went back to the things they were each supposed to be doing, in the room that had stopped being only a room sometime between October and January. Somewhere in the 38 floors of the dark. She went to the soccer game. She told herself it was a Saturday morning, and she had been working every Saturday morning since February, and that this was not a significant decision. She had, the night before, spent 20 minutes considering what to wear to a 6-year-old soccer game, which she recognized as a disproportionate amount of time, and which told her something she declined to examine directly. She arrived at the parking area outside the field at 8:52, and there was a 6-year-old in a green jersey running toward the car with the specific velocity of a child who had been told someone was coming and had decided to greet them at maximum speed. Benny Hadley ran directly to the passenger side of her car and knocked on the glass with both hands. She lowered the window. He said, "Are you Margot?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Dad said you run a building. Do you know how the elevators work?" She said, "Better than most people." He thought about this. He said, "Dad fixed one." "I know," she said. "I was there." He looked at her with the particular expression children had when they were evaluating whether an adult was trustworthy. He had Cole's eyes. Or she thought he did. She had not looked at Cole's eyes specifically enough to be certain, which told her something about how she'd been looking at Cole, which was a thing she was not examining today. Benny said, "You can sit by me." He ran back to the field. She looked after him for a moment. She looked at Cole, who was standing near the sideline with the particular expression of a father watching his son be entirely himself. She moved across the parking area toward the field, toward the cold April morning and the green jerseys, and a 6-year-old who had decided, with the confident simplicity of a child who didn't know to be guarded, that she was welcome. It was, she would think later, the most straightforward invitation she had received in years. She accepted it. Benny had 7 shots on goal and scored twice, and narrated both goals in real time while they were happening, which Cole said was typical. Margot watched and said nothing, and said, at the final whistle, that he had good instincts for angles. Benny said, "Dad says everything is about angles." "Your dad's right," she said. Benny looked between them with the expression of a child conducting an assessment. "Are you friends?" he said. Cole said, "Yes." Benny said, "Or the other kind of friends?" Cole said, "Benny." Benny said, "What?" Margot said, "Both." Probably, Benny considered this. He said, "Okay, can we get pancakes?" They got pancakes. It was, in the accumulated record of how things became what they became, as simple as that. Not dramatic, not announced, Just a child asking a direct question and two adults who had spent months being honest about everything else finally being honest about that. Over pancakes, Benny explained to Margot his theory of soccer, which was that the important thing was to know where everyone was going to be before they got there. He said his dad had taught him that. Cole said he hadn't, exactly, and Benny said, "Yes, you did, you just didn't know you were teaching it." Cole looked at Margot. She was looking at Benny with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet, unguarded, genuinely amused. The expression of a person who had stopped performing any version of themselves for a small amount of time. Not relaxed, Margot Voss was not a person who fully relaxed, probably ever, and he found he didn't want her to be. The precision was part of what she was. But this was the precision with the performance stripped away. Just her, paying attention to a 6-year-old who was telling her something he thought was important. She looked up and found him watching. She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" She said, "Make a thing of it." He said, "I'm not." She said, "Good." He wasn't. But he was internally making a thing of it in the specific way he made things of things that mattered. Quietly, completely. In a place she couldn't see, because it wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be said out loud yet. Yet Benny ate his pancakes and told them about his friend Marcus at school, who had tried to build a go-kart and made several structural errors that Benny, who had been raised by a man who talked about structural integrity the way other men talked about sports, had identified clearly. They listened. Cole and Margot in the April morning and the pancakes cooling on the table. Two people and a child who had decided they were already something, sitting in a diner on a Saturday, being what they were. The Sundays started in May. Not announced, nothing between them was announced, things simply became true, and they acknowledged the truth after the fact. The first Sunday was a question from Cole. "Benny wants to show you something he's building, if you have time this weekend." She had said yes. She had come to the house on the south side where Cole and Benny lived, a 2-bedroom on a street with a lot of trees and a garage Cole used as a workshop. She had met the workshop and Benny's current project, which was a model of a bridge using popsicle sticks and PVC pipe, and a theory of load distribution that was incorrect but ambitious. She had told him it was incorrect, and told him why, and told him how to correct it, and he had listened with the focused attention of a child receiving good data. Cole had watched this from the kitchen doorway with his coffee, not saying anything. Watching his son and this woman have a conversation about load distribution at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, and thinking about all the things he had not planned and all the things that had happened anyway. After that, the Sundays continued. Not every Sunday. Some Sundays. The kind that built a rhythm without being declared a routine. The recovery was confirmed in June. Dr. Keel called it partial functional recovery, incomplete spinal cord injury, good prognosis for continued improvement with sustained rehabilitation. She said it with the careful conservatism of someone who had learned not to promise timelines. She said, "I can tell you what's true right now. And right now you are bearing weight on both legs for 31 seconds, which is a different number than 12 seconds. And before that 7, and before that nothing." Margot sat in the rehabilitation room afterward for a long time. She thought about the building she ran, and the building she'd been in when the structural failure happened, and the building she'd designed in her 30s that had, unknowingly, already anticipated this. The lobby she'd spec'd with wide corridors, the conference room she'd insisted on ground floor access for, the things she had built for bodies she hadn't yet learned to build for. She thought about 31 seconds on the mat, and the feeling of the floor under both feet at the same time. She thought about what had changed and what hadn't. She was still the same person who had walked into Voss Capital 11 years ago and built it into what it was. She was still direct and impatient with inefficiency, and capable of reading a situation in 30 seconds and extracting the essential fact. She was still the person who ran the building, who knew every corridor and every fault and every item on the maintenance list. All of that was unchanged. What had changed was this. She had spent 5 years managing the gap between what her body did and what she needed it to do, and she had managed it by making the gap invisible, by becoming expert at the management of the gap, by making her competence so comprehensive and her execution so precise that the gap never had to be named. Cole had not named the gap. That was not what he had done. What he had done was stand at the edge of it and say, "This is what's there." Not to fix it for her, not to make it smaller, just to say it so she didn't have to carry the weight of pretending it wasn't there. That was the different thing. That was the thing she had not known how to accept for 5 years. Someone seeing the gap and staying anyway. Not in spite of it. Just staying. The way you stayed in a building that needed work, because the building was worth it and the work was the work. She called Cole from the parking structure. He answered on the second ring. She said, 31 seconds. A pause. Then she heard him exhale. Slow. Complete. The sound of someone letting something down they'd been holding carefully for a while. He said, Margot. She said, Dr. Keeley says the prognosis has changed. She says it's real. He said, yes, it is. She said, I'm going to keep saying I don't know how to do this. He said, I know. She said, and you're going to keep showing up anyway. He said, that's been the plan. She said, I'll see you Thursday. He said, I'll be there. She sat in the parking structure for a few minutes more, in the car. In the June afternoon, thinking about a wrench with worn chrome, and a man who had carried her 38 floors without announcing it, who had built the list before anyone asked, who had shown up in October and never quite stopped. She had spent 5 years building walls that were very good at looking like competence. Smooth, exterior, every joint tight. Nothing visible from the outside that would tell you where the structure was compensating. He had read the building. He had found the fault in the transfer switch, and he had found the fault in the person who ran the building, and he had fixed the first one and sat with the second one and waited, the way he waited for everything, patiently, without performing patience, until it was time. She put the car in drive. She drove back to her building, which was hers, which was full of people doing work, which had a mechanical room in the basement with a rebuilt chiller and 17 corrected items and a few more that Stonebridge was scheduled to address in Q3. She drove back to her building and went to work. Stonebridge Mechanical became what Cole had always known it could be. Given the right contract base and enough time to build a team without hemorrhaging cash trying to underbid the jobs that needed to be done right. By September, he had 9 employees, including 3 who had been in the industry for decades and had come specifically because the kind of work Stonebridge did, thorough, honest, no upsell for the sake of it, was the kind of work they'd wanted to do for years without finding a firm that would let them. He didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the growth. He spent time solving the problems in front of him, which was what he'd always done, and the growth was what happened when you solved the problems in front of you without padding the scope. Margot noticed. She mentioned it once in a way that was not a compliment exactly, but was the closest thing she had to one in a professional context. Your Q3 invoice is 12% under your projected estimate. He said, the job came in clean. She said, most contractors would have found something to add. He said, I'm not most contractors. She looked at him. He held her gaze. Neither of them said anything else about it. They had been since April the other kind of friends, which was the kind that didn't require naming, because both parties understood what it was, and neither of them felt any urgency to perform it for an audience. It was quiet, and it was honest, and it contained, on both sides, the particular tenderness of 2 people who had each carried something very heavy for very long and had found, without planning to, that the other person made the carrying different. Not lighter. Different. There was a distinction, and both of them understood it. The load was still the load. But carrying it in a room where someone else also understood what the load was, not trying to take it, not pretending it wasn't there, just present while it was being carried, that was different. That was the thing that had no good name yet, and that neither of them was trying to name, because some things held their meaning better when you didn't rush them to a word. Benny liked her. He had decided this at the soccer game and had not revisited the decision, because Benny, like his father, did not generally revisit decisions that had been made correctly the first time. He had taken to explaining to her, at the dinners they had begun to share on some Sundays, the structural principles behind whatever he was building or planning to build. Because he had figured out that she found this interesting and he was right. She did not just find it interesting. She engaged with it. She corrected errors with the same economy she brought to everything, directly, without softening, with specific language about what was wrong and why. Benny received these corrections the way his father received them, as information, which was the only way either of them knew how to receive things. Cole had watched this pattern develop over the summer Sundays and had found himself thinking about Ruth again, about the specific way Ruth had loved Benny, which was completely and without apology and with the absolute conviction that he deserved to be told the truth about things. And he had thought, it's not the same thing. But it is a thing. A real thing. A thing that lives in the same part of the world as what Ruth gave him, without being a replacement for it. He had sat with that thought for a long time. One Sunday in October, the anniversary of Cole's first visit to the building, though neither of them said this out loud, Benny was explaining his theory of bridges, which was that the important thing was the tension and not the suspension. And Margot was asking questions with the genuine attention of someone who found the theory worth engaging, and Cole was at the stove making the pasta Benny had requested, and the kitchen was warm, and the October evening was cold outside the window, and he was thinking about Ruth the way he thought about Ruth on October evenings, with gratitude that she had been exactly who she was and with the clarity of a man who had lived long enough after the hardest thing to know that the hardest thing was not the whole story. He was also thinking about the wrench on the windowsill. It had been there since January, since the night he had come home from the 40 floor carry and put it on the sill without deciding to, the way you put things in the place they belonged. It caught the morning light and the evening light, and it was the same wrench it had always been, which was the point. His grandfather had given it to him on the day of his first real job. He had said, "A tool that works is worth more than 10 that almost work." He had said it about the wrench and about everything. Cole had carried the wrench for 16 years because it was the truest thing he owned, and he had held it out to Margot in the stairwell on the 38th floor in a January ice storm because she had needed something true to hold on to. She had held it for 38 floors. She had given it back. He had put it on the windowsill. It was still there. Benny said, "Are you still the other kind of friends?" Cole said, from the stove, "Benny." Benny said, "What?" "It's a real question." Margot said, "Yes." Benny said, "Good." He went back to his bridge theory. Cole turned from the stove and looked at her. She was looking at Benny. Her expression was the unguarded one, the one he'd first seen at the soccer game, the one that lived underneath all the competence and the precision and the 5 years of armor. She looked up and found him watching. She said, "Don't." He said, "I'm not making a thing of it." She said, "Good." He wasn't. He was just standing in his kitchen on an October evening, looking at the people in it, thinking that the building he was standing in was full of everything he needed. And the walls were load-bearing, and the structure was sound. There is a version of this story that people tell about physical recovery, about the 31 seconds on the mat, the progression from 12 to 20 to 31, the prognosis that changed. That version is real, and it matters. But it is not the story. The story is about a woman who used contempt as insulation, and a man who noticed the insulation and didn't try to strip it off, and didn't pretend it wasn't there. Who kept doing the work? Who fixed the things that needed fixing, and wrote down the things that needed writing, and showed up when the building went dark, and carried what needed to be carried without making a ceremony of it. Margot Voss had spent 5 years convincing herself that the wheelchair was the reason the walls were necessary. It wasn't. The walls were always there. The accident had just given her a better explanation for them. What changed was not the legs. What changed was the man who walked into the building with a limp she'd been thoughtless about and a wrench in his pocket, and a 6-year-old who wanted to meet the lady from the building, and who kept coming back, every Thursday, every emergency, every Saturday morning ice storm, until she stopped treating his presence as a variable and started treating it as a constant, which was how he had treated her from the beginning. Not as a tragedy to be managed, or a condition to be worked around, or a powerful woman to be impressed. As the person who ran the building. As the person who'd built the 17-item list before anyone asked. As the person who said "I'm sorry" in an ice-cold office on the 38th floor without being prompted. Not because it would get her anything, but because it was the honest thing and she was a person who, when stripped of performance, defaulted to honesty. He had seen that on the first day. He had read the building correctly from the start. There is a cost to refusing help. It is not weakness, the refusal. It is something more specific, a decision that the maintenance of your own architecture matters more than the relief of letting someone else do the load-bearing for a while. It makes sense. It is a reasonable response to a world that has demonstrated it cannot always be trusted with the things you need to protect. It is also, over time, expensive. The structure that carries everything alone eventually develops the particular silence of a building under too much stress. It holds, it holds, it holds, and then something shifts in a transfer switch, and the lights go out and you are alone on the 38th floor in the dark. Cole Hadley had not rescued Margot Voss. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed someone who would do the work that needed doing without performing it. Someone who read the building and told the truth about what he found. Someone who climbed 38 floors on a rebuilt leg without once asking her to be grateful. She had been grateful anyway. She had been grateful in the specific way that wasn't about the carry. It was about the October morning in the corridor when he'd said, "I'm aware," and had moved past her and had not made her apology necessary or her cruelty defining, and had come back anyway. And again. And again. Not because he forgave it in any formal sense. Because he had looked at the structure and understood that the insulation was not the building. He came back for the building. The building was worth coming back for. Consider what it means that she let him. Margot Voss, who had turned away 3 contractors and 2 personal aides, and a dedicated parking arrangement, and the office renovation her board proposed, and the co-CEO suggestion from Harrington and every other offer that carried, embedded in its structure. The implication that she was something other than the most capable person in the room. She turned away everything that implied a limit. She had been doing it for 5 years. And then a man showed up with a clipboard and a headlamp and a rebuilt leg and a 17-item list he had built without being asked, and he did not imply anything. He showed her the items. He said, "This is what's there." He waited. That was the different thing. Not the doing. She had always been surrounded by people who did. The waiting. The absence of the implied correction in the help. The help that was just information. Just, here is what the building needs, and I will fix it. And I am not going to require anything from you in exchange for the fixing except payment at the agreed rate. She had not known she was waiting for that. She had been so thoroughly committed to not waiting for anything that she had not noticed the waiting. And then he was there, in the corridor, saying, "I'm aware of my limp," and moving past her, and she had looked at the wrench in his pocket and filed it, and kept working, and 6 weeks later she had been talking to him in a mechanical room about compressor housing, and the world had already shifted in a direction she had not decided to move. That was the thing nobody told you about refusing help for long enough. The refusal became the thing you were. And then someone came along and treated you like the person you were before the refusal began, and you had to remember, slowly and with effort, that you had always been that person too. The bridge theory was wrong. Benny had been certain it was right, because he was 6 and had the confidence of someone who had not yet accumulated enough data to know how often certainty was premature. Margot had told him so. The tension is part of it, but you've got the load path wrong. The load has to transfer through the anchorage before the tension does anything. Your model has it backwards. Benny had looked at the model. He had looked at Margot. He had looked at the model again. He had said, "Okay, show me." So she had taken a pencil and the back of the grocery receipt on the table and drawn the load path, the anchorage, the sequence, the way the tension in the cable worked, only because the anchorage was holding the forces in balance. She had drawn it the way she had learned to draw engineering problems, which was clearly and without ornament, with the exact information and nothing extra. Benny had studied the drawing. He had said, "So I need to fix the anchorage." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Can we do it now?" She had said, "After dinner." After dinner they had fixed the anchorage. Cole had come to stand in the doorway of Benny's room holding a dish towel, watching his son and this woman correct the structural error in the popsicle stick bridge, Benny listening with the focused attention he reserved for information he intended to use, Margot showing him with the precision she brought to everything. He had stood in the doorway and thought, this is the whole of it. This kitchen on this evening. This child learning what's true. This woman teaching him without softening it. This is the whole of it. That is what the wrench meant. Worn chrome. Grandfather's tool. The thing that worked, better than 10 that almost worked, in his pocket every day, not because he needed it to do the job, but because some things you carried because they were true, and because carrying them was how you remembered what you were doing all of this for. He was doing it for the building. He was doing it for Benny. He was doing it, in the end, for the woman who had run the building alone for 5 years and had built an insulation so thorough it had started to look like competence, and had eventually, in the dark of a January stairwell, stopped performing it for 38 floors, and had held on to the honest weight of a tool that worked and let herself be carried. That is the whole of the story. That is, as it turns out, enough, not because it is tidy. It is not tidy. The transfer switch on the Voss Capitol building failed on January 17th because it had been deferred. And deferred maintenance was always a calculation about which future cost was acceptable. The cost had come due in an ice storm. Cole had fixed it. Warren Fitch rebuilt on honest ground. He stayed. He was better at his job for knowing what he'd nearly done with it. He and Margot never discussed it again, which was its own kind of resolution. Two people who understood what had happened and had both decided the future was more useful than the accounting.